A photo captures a smile. A young woman in a crisp uniform poses for the camera. She looks like a sister, a daughter, a neighbor. She smells of lavender perfume. In her pocket is a love letter to a fiancé, filled with mundane complaints about the weather. The camera zooms. Focus on the eyes. The warmth disappears. The scene shifts to a mountain of tangled limbs and gray skin. The lavender scent vanishes. Now there is only the thick, oily stench of burning hair and human fat. 3,700 women served as SS guards. This is the entire population of a small German town. They managed the apocalypse in shifts. The contrast was the weapon. 1 hour, they wrote to their mothers about the spring flowers. The next, they used heavy leather boots to crush the ribs of a prisoner. They did not just follow orders. They invented cruelty. They turned humiliation into a sport. Violence became a domestic routine. These women proved that a normal life can exist inches away from a mass grave. History cannot explain the transition. The letters remained polite. The smiles remained bright. By the end of the war, the system employed 3,700 female guards. These smiles ended at a specific geographic point. Occupied Poland, 1940. The Nazis built Auschwitz. It began as a prison for political captives. It evolved into a factory of death. 3 distinct zones formed the complex. Auschwitz I, the administrative center. Auschwitz II Birkenau, the extermination site with gas chambers and crematoria. Auschwitz III Monowitz, a slave labor camp for German industry. The scale exceeded comprehension. 1,100,000 people were murdered here. This number is larger than the entire population of Cologne during those years. Gas, starvation, disease, exhaustion. The machine never stopped. Men did not run this system alone. Women held the keys. Between 1942 and 1945, the SS stationed 200 female guards across the complex. They were called Aufseherinnen. They supervised forced labor. They maintained order during selections. By the end of the war, the system employed 200 female guards at this single location. The gray uniforms and black boots were standard. The silver SS runes on the lapels signaled absolute authority. Among the 200 female guards at Auschwitz, one face stood out. It belonged to a 19-year-old girl. Her name was Irma Grese. She arrived in 1943. She was the age of a first-year university student, but instead of books, she carried a heavy, custom-made whip. Grese began her day with a ritual. She applied expensive French perfume. She polished her heavy leather boots until they shone. Then, she stepped into the freezing mud of the barracks. The whistle of her whip cut through the frost. She did not see prisoners, she saw animals. Grese shouted orders and spat insults at women twice her age. Disobedience meant a death sentence. She personally conducted selections. With a casual wave of her hand, she divided thousands. Life to the right, the gas chambers to the left. Her cruelty lacked a rational motive. It was pure theater. She forced women to stand naked in the snow for hours. She watched their skin turn blue. When she grew bored, she released her trained, half-starved dogs. They tore into human flesh while she watched. Even seasoned SS men found her behavior excessive. She did not just follow orders. Grese smiled during the beatings. She drew a visible, physical pleasure from the agony of others. Irma Grese did not emerge from a vacuum. She was a product of 1933. When Adolf Hitler took power, he inherited a nation broken by the aftermath of the Great War. 6 million people were unemployed. Hunger was a political tool. Hitler promised a rebuild, but he delivered a cage. The regime infiltrated every kitchen and every classroom. Society was split by gender. Men belonged to the front or the police. Women were relegated to the cradle and the hearth. Their official duty was motherhood. Their mission was the production of pure Germans. For years, the military remained a male sanctuary, but the crusade for Lebensraum required more blood than Germany could spare. By 1942, the maps were bleeding. The Wehrmacht was overstretched from the frozen plains of the Soviet Union to the deserts of North Africa. At home, the concentration camp network was metastasizing. Thousands of new prisoners arrived daily. The system faced a logistical crisis. There were no men left to man the towers. The front lines had swallowed the men. By 1942, the Reich faced a vacuum in the rear. To fill the watchtowers, the SS turned to a new resource. Job centers across Germany began posting unusual vacancies. Who answered the call? Most were ordinary women between 20 and 35. They were nurses, teachers, and shop clerks from quiet provincial towns. They sat in recruitment offices, smelling the fresh ink of newspapers and the heavy scent of wartime tobacco. For many, this was not about ideology. It was about a paycheck. The state promised steady wages and warm housing. In a country gripped by rationing, these were powerful lures. But there was a deeper psychological pull. The uniform changed everything. Yesterday's factory worker now wore the sharp gray tailoring of the SS. She felt the weight of the leather belt. She felt the sudden silence when she entered a room. In a society that confined women to the kitchen, the camp hierarchy offered a terrifying shortcut to power. They were no longer daughters or sisters. They were Aufseherinnen, overseers. The transition from civilian to guard happened in weeks. They traded their textbooks and bandages for whistles and heavy boots. It was a career move with a hidden price. By signing the contract, they crossed a threshold into a machine designed for annihilation. The training at Ravensbrück was the next step. 50 miles north of Berlin, a distance covered in 1 hour by train. This was the destination for every nurse and teacher who answered the call. 1939. The war had not yet begun, but the machinery was ready. Ravensbrück opened its gates. It was the only major concentration camp built exclusively for women, a training ground for a new kind of soldier. 130,000 prisoners passed through these gates. Jewish women, Polish resistance, Roma, children as young as 8 years old. They lived in wooden barracks, sleeping on planks, slowly starving. Behind the barbed wire, the SS built a school. The curriculum was simple. Recruiting offices sent hundreds of women here from across the Reich. Training lasted only a few weeks. The state provided the uniform and the authority. The system broke the recruits. It stripped away their compassion. Instructors taught one core lesson. The women in rags were not human. They were enemies of the state. New guards learned to handle weapons and shout orders. They practiced punishments until the hesitation vanished. The goal of the training was to kill pit. The textbook for these women was Dorothea Binz. She patrolled the camp with a bullwhip in one hand and a pistol in the other. How do you teach a former nurse to kill? Through personal example. Binz stood before the new recruits. A prisoner stumbled during roll call. Binz moved. She struck the woman across the face with the whip handle. The recruits watched. Then, Binz handed the whip to a novice and waited. The student mimicked the strike. Hesitation died. By 1944, the camp had mutated into a machine with over 30 subcamps. Routine became a weapon. Prisoners dug trenches and hauled stones from dawn until the sun vanished. They survived on a single crust of bread and watery soup. Those who collapsed did not get back up. Ravensbrück also served as a laboratory for the unthinkable. Doctors performed medical experiments on the rabbits, the nickname for Polish prisoners. They broke healthy leg bones with hammers. They rubbed dirt and bacteria into the open wounds to simulate battlefield infections. The guards did not turn away. They held the women down on the operating tables. They listened to the wet crunch of fracturing bone. They laughed as the infection took hold. Cruelty was now a standardized skill. The training was complete. Thousands of graduates left Ravensbrück and boarded trains for other camps across the Reich. The graduates of Binz found their new master in Auschwitz. Her name was Maria Mandl. She did not just oversee prisoners, she managed a conveyor belt of death. Mandl stood on the gravel path. 500,000 women passed before her eyes. That is the entire population of Lyon. Gone. The process was mechanical. Mandl walked along the silent rows. She did not scream. She did not hesitate. Her white-gloved hand moved in the air. A finger pointed left. A finger pointed right. Those marked as weak stepped out of line. The sick followed. Then the trucks arrived. Drivers started the engines. The vibration felt like a low hum in the dirt. These women were headed straight to the gas chambers. Mandel watched them leave without blinking. Cruelty required a soundtrack. Mandel created the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz. She handpicked musicians from the starving crowds. Imagine the scene. A group of women in striped rags clutching violins. They play Mozart. They play Schubert. The classical notes float over the camp, sweet and precise. Under this music, thousands of others marched toward the chimneys. The melody drowned out the crying. Beside her stood Therese Brandl. She was the muscle of the operation. Brandl beat prisoners unconscious for a loose button or a heavy sigh. It was a hierarchy of terror. Mandel provided the vision, Brandl provided the pain. The tally of the dead under her command exceeded 500,000. Under Mandel's command, cruelty became the only currency for career growth. Female guards in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen turned sadism into a competition. They viewed the slightest spark of kindness as a terminal weakness. To rise in the SS ranks, they had to prove they were tougher than the men. The hierarchy thrived on theft and terror. A guard's hand would flash with the gold of a stolen ring, stripped from a prisoner's finger. They looted jewelry, silk dresses, and rations while the barracks starved. Fear was their primary tool of management. Survival for the guards meant being the most feared person in the block. Cruelty here was not a machine, it was personal. Survivors later recalled that the women guards were more terrifying than the men. They didn't just want to kill the body, they aimed for dignity. They mocked, insulted, and tortured with a specific, feminine malice that felt like a betrayal of their own nature. A single crust of bread shared in secret often ended in a public execution. The violence stayed intimate. This internal competition birthed the Stomping Mares at the Majdanek concentration camp. Near Lublin, the killing shifted from individual cruelty to a factory floor. How many could the system process at once? Majdanek operated 7 gas chambers simultaneously. Carbon monoxide and Zyklon B functioned in parallel. The crematorium chimneys never cooled. They burned day and night. Hermine Braunsteiner patrolled this industrial hell. She was young, she was blonde, she was a professional. Braunsteiner approached a prone woman. She raised her leg. A heavy leather boot smashed into the prisoner's ribs. A dull, wet thud echoed against the wooden barracks. Braunsteiner paused. She looked down at the scuff on her polished toe. She wiped it clean. She smiled. Survivors watched her from the shadows. She dragged women by their hair across the gravel. She targeted the weak during the selection process. She screamed at those who could no longer stand. The prisoners gave her a name, the Stomping Mare. It came from the rhythmic, heavy sound of her boots hitting human bone. It was the sound of the system working. By the end of its operation, Majdanek had processed and murdered 360,000 people. While Elsa Erik decided who would live in Majdanek, the system prepared a new circle of hell. She was young. She was efficient. Her chilling precision turned every selection into a cold mathematical equation. Erik stood on the platform as the crowded trains arrived from across occupied Europe. Most prisoners believed the lie of relocation for work. They were wrong. Erik oversaw the lines. With a single gesture, she separated families. Men to the left, women and small children to the right. The right meant the gas chambers. Did she feel anything? During the selections, the air filled with the screams of children pulled from their mother's arms. Erik did not flinch. She treated mass murder as a routine clerical task. Like the other female guards, she had completely detached herself from human emotion. Cruelty was simply her job description. The machinery of Majdanek ran smoothly because of this indifference. Guards maintained the daily terror without hesitation or doubt. But the war was shifting. The Nazis began moving the remaining prisoners to camps like Bergen-Belsen. There, the industrial order of Majdanek would collapse into a landscape of rotting bodies and unchecked disease. The guards watched the final transports leave. They showed no remorse. They showed no fear. They stood in total silence. The convoys from Elsa Erik and other matrons now crawled toward a single point on the map: Bergen-Belsen. Originally a small camp for high-value prisoners, by 1944 it had transformed into a dumping ground for the dying. The logistics of the Reich were failing. What did the camp become without management? A graveyard under the open sky. The trains arrived from the east. SS guards threw open the heavy wooden doors. Dozens of corpses tumbled onto the gravel. Those still alive were too weak to step over the dead. They stayed inside, staring into the gray light of northern Germany. The mechanism of the camp had seized up. To the west, the Rhine flowed only 100 kilometers away, but the pipes here were dry. There was no water, no bread, no medicine. The air carried a heavy, sweet stench. It was the smell of thousands of unburied bodies rotting in the sun, mixing with the acrid smoke of the small crematorium. Prisoners crawled through the mud. They tore bark from the trees. They chewed on dry grass. Typhus and dysentery moved through the barracks like a physical wave. In 1944, the death rate climbed until the system of records simply stopped. The piles of bodies grew faster than the labor details could dig trenches. Amidst this decay, the female guards maintained a grotesque order. Irma Grese arrived from Auschwitz, carrying her leather whip. Beside her stood Elisabeth Volkenrath. They walked past rows of skeletons as if the suffering were invisible. To them, the prisoners were no longer human. They were inventory for a warehouse that was burning down. As the front lines closed in, the last remnants of discipline vanished. The SS command realized the end was near. They stopped the meager rations entirely. They cut the water. Then, the guards began to drop their rifles and vanish into the woods. The SS guards abandoned their posts and left the gates swinging open. Amidst the rotting landscape of Bergen-Belsen, 21-year-old Irma Grese felt like the mistress of the world. This was the age of a university graduate. Grese, however, commanded a death camp. She stayed near the gates after the British arrived. She blended into the crowd of captured SS men. It was a calculated risk. But the survivors remembered her face. They pointed. The British soldiers were stunned. Beside her stood Elisabeth Volkenrath, another pillar of the camp hierarchy. These were not monsters from folklore. They were young women in neat uniforms. Grese did not look away. She did not tremble. Witnesses later described a specific, haunting detail. While prisoners collapsed under her lash, Grese often laughed. It was not a nervous reaction. It was genuine amusement. The hunt expanded across the collapsing Reich. Dorothea Binz tried to vanish into the German interior. Soviet scouts found her. Hermann Braunsteiner crossed the border into Austria. She took a false name. She built a new life. It took years for the shadow of the past to catch her. In interrogation rooms, the defiance remained. The women sat straight. They spoke of duty. They claimed they were cogs in a massive machine. Some whispered that a refusal to serve meant an execution. They painted themselves as victims of a system they helped manage. The survivors told a different story. They spoke of games made out of torture. They spoke of refined cruelty. In the end, every high-ranking female guard used the same defense. They claimed they simply obeyed every standing order. 10,000 unburied bodies. This was the first thing the British saw. The corpses rotted in the open air, piled like cordwood. The illusion of Grese's absolute power shattered on April 15, 1945. British tanks tore through the perimeter wire. They found 60,000 survivors. To visualize the scale, this is the entire population of a medium-sized European city. But these were not citizens. They were ghosts. The liberators stepped into a landscape of bone and stench. Soldiers and doctors stared in silence. A healthy adult male usually weighs 160 pounds. Here, the average survivor weighed less than 70. 30 kilograms of skin and despair. The British did not just watch. They brought lenses and light. Photographers set up tripods near the mass graves. The female guards watched as the lenses turned toward them. The cameras began to film. The cameras that filmed the mass graves now turned toward the dock in Lüneburg. The Belsen trial began on September 17, 1945. It was the first time a British military court judged women as major war criminals on equal footing with men. 45 defendants sat in the rows. 11 were women. Irma Grese sat among them. She was 22 years old. While survivors recounted her habit of setting dogs on prisoners, Grese remained composed. She adjusted her hair. She listened to the interpreter. Her gaze drifted across the courtroom, cold and indifferent. This contrast between her youthful appearance and the testimony of her cruelty captivated the press. Elizabeth Volkenrath and Wanna Bormann stood beside her. The evidence against all three was overwhelming. The judge's wooden gavel struck the bench for the final time. The court sentenced them to death. Execution was set for December 13, 1945. One by one, they climbed the wooden steps. The ropes were adjusted. The trap door snapped open. Grese, Volkenrath, and Bormann died by hanging. While Grese ascended the scaffold, thousands of her colleagues tried to vanish. They needed to erase their past. Fear replaced their former arrogance. How can a killer disappear, burn the uniform, cut the hair, and claim to be a refugee? The transformation started with a blade. Women who once spent hours on their appearance now sheared their hair to the scalp. They did not want to look like guards. They wanted to look like victims. The smell of burning wool filled the air. Silver SS runes melted in the flames. Thousands of uniforms turned to ash. These women swapped their leather boots for rags. They traded their whips for false identities. The mechanic of the escape was simple. Burn the wool, forge a name, create a legend. Millions of displaced people flooded the roads of 1945. Total chaos was their best defense. Some guards claimed they were forced laborers. Others blended into the columns of starving refugees. In the ruins of Germany, a new name was often enough to stay free. But the documentation survived. Allied investigators arrived at the liberated camps. They did not just bring food. They brought cameras and notebooks. Survivor testimonies became the primary weapon. The victims were weak and sick, yet their memory was surgical. They described the shape of a jaw, the sound of a voice, or the specific way a guard held a club. Soldiers collected camp records and abandoned identification cards. These scraps of paper became death warrants. The hunt for the women who ran the camps moved into a new phase. The investigators began their systematic search. One of those who successfully vanished was Hermine Braunsteiner. While Grese climbed the gallows, Braunsteiner was already preparing her exit from Europe. 1946. A brief imprisonment in Austria. A quick release. She did not wait for a second arrest. Braunsteiner fled the continent. She moved to Canada, then crossed the border into the United States. She settled in Queens, New York. Her new name was Mrs. Ryan. For 15 years, she was the perfect neighbor. The contrast was absolute. In New York, she was a quiet housewife. She baked pies. She waved to the neighbors from her porch. But in Majdanek, they called her the Stomping Mare. She wore heavy, steel-rimmed boots. She used them to kick children and elderly women to death. The suburban silence lasted until 1964. Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal followed a lead to a small house in the American suburbs. The scene was surgical. Agents knocked on the door. Mrs. Ryan opened it. The neighbors watched from their lawns, confused. They saw a polite woman. The investigators saw a mass murderer. Extradition took years of legal battles. Finally, she returned to a German courtroom to face the ghosts of Majdanek. Her victims were no longer silent. In 1981, 36 years after the war ended, she received a life sentence. While Hermine Braunsteiner built a new life in Queens, history remained frozen in the winter of 1945. On the icy roads of Helmbrechts, the Nazi system was collapsing. But the killing did not stop. It accelerated. The order was simple: evacuate. The reality was a death march. 580 women stepped into the snow. Most were Jewish. They had no food, no rest, only the rhythm of boots on ice. This column stretched for half a kilometer, a line of shadows moving through the freezing fog. Louise Dance watched the ranks. She was a veteran of Plaszow, the camp made infamous by Schindler's List. She knew the routine. At Plaszow, women died for crying, for slowing down, for existing. Now, on the road, the rules were tighter. A prisoner collapses. A guard stops. A single shot. This happened every mile. The roadside became a graveyard of frozen bodies. The guards were young. Some were the same age as their victims. They showed no pity. They showed no hesitation. They showed only the efficiency of the SS network. The march was hundreds of miles. The temperature stayed below zero. By the time the Allied troops arrived, the column had vanished. Over half of the 580 women were dead. On the other side of this blood-soaked map, in the Stutthof concentration camp, 23-year-old Gerda Steinhoff was building her career. Stutthof sat near the city of Gdansk. It was one of the first camps built outside German borders. It became one of the last to be liberated. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 115 women served there as guards. They managed a factory of death where Jews, Poles, and Soviet prisoners perished from typhus, starvation, or Zyklon B. Steinhoff stood out among the veterans. She was young. She was energetic. While others followed orders with cold indifference, Gerda brought a terrifying personal touch to the selections. Witnesses later remembered one specific detail. When Steinhoff pointed her finger at those destined for the gas chambers, she smiled. For her, the process of filtering the living from the dead was not a chore. It was a source of visible satisfaction. The end came quickly. In 1946, a Polish court in Gdansk reviewed the evidence of her cruelty. The trial did not drag on for decades. Steinhoff was found guilty of crimes against humanity. At 24 years old, she became one of the youngest female war criminals in history to face the gallows. On July 4, 1946, a crowd gathered to watch her public execution. Steinhoff went to the gallows in 1946, but thousands of other names remained in the shadows for decades. 3,700 women. This was enough to staff an entire combat division. They served as wardens, administrators, and execution assistants across 30 major concentration camps. Most never faced a judge. They returned home, found jobs, and raised families. They blended in. Only years later did researchers uncover the true scale of the female SS network. The system relied on them. The hunt did not stop. In 2015, German prosecutors reopened the case of Hilda Michnia. She was 92 years old. Investigators tracked her path from Bergen-Belsen to Gross-Rosen. For 70 years, she lived a quiet, normal life while her victims carried the trauma to their graves. Justice arrived late, but it arrived. Today, European memorials serve a single purpose. They stand as a warning to future generations.